If you want to be a part of a future Creepy Confessions video, I'm looking for scary experiences from bartenders, police officers, and security guards. Go to darknessprevails.org to send your story. I know I shared a few Hunter Confession stories in the last episode of Creepy Confessions, but I had to have more. Because when people go looking for things and preying upon things, sometimes they find something they weren't looking for, unless something finds them first. Enjoy these dark confessions from hunters with the sounds of a flowing river. One. Failed attempt, or was it? By LupineBane. This is going to sound crazy at first, but as the story goes on, I hope it begins to make sense to you. I am a hunter, and oftentimes that means I'm an explorer too. I go traditional bow hunting in extremely rural places, and on this night in particular, that was forever changed. Like a fool, I was alone, and I had pushed on much further than I wanted to. The Blue Ridge Mountains in North Georgia will do that to you. I've always considered myself a good bushcrafter, and had confidence in my skills to keep safe in most situations. It was almost dark, and I had been climbing down some hills and knew I should just camp and go back in the morning. I cooked up some rabbit, and of course took some cool bushcraft selfies. Soon I was dozing off, when suddenly there was a loud, deafening boom that made me jump out of my skin. The sound was metallic, like tin roofing being slammed. I quickly thought it was moonshiners, or another type of shady people. I shoved everything back into my small pack, and then I put out my fire. I sat still, waiting to hear anything, and then I heard it again, that metallic bang. It was more like stressed metal about to give. My fingers trembled on my bow, anxious at the thought that I may have to use it in self-defense. I crept down the ridge, hoping to see a pickup, simply loading up some gear and leaving. But I saw darkness. No fire, no flashlights, no other people anywhere. I stood there, contemplating what to do next, and as I went to take my next step, I heard the loud, crashing sound again. I froze solid. The sound was coming from right in front of me, just down the hill. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a large homemade cage, like the ones you would see at the mouth of a mine. I could then see what looked like a campsite that had been abandoned quickly. There were small fire pits with smoking ash still. Then I could make out an unsettling amount of animal bones. That's when the smell hit me, the rot of meat. I was so zoned in at what I was looking at that I hadn't really given the cage much attention, thinking at that point it was probably the skeleton to make a makeshift tent. And that's when it happened. I was still behind the rocks in the hill, mostly hidden, but the feeling of dread came over me hard, and it nearly made me sick. It was like the most primal sense of knowing you're prey and you're about to meet your demise. I dropped my bow, not giving two craps about hunting or stealth at that point, and I grabbed my sidearm instead. Before I could look over the rocks again, the most disturbing and horrifying scream bellowed out. It was so loud and deep, I could feel it rumbling in my chest. It was all wrong. There was nothing on God's green earth that makes that sound. It was like some sort of siren, and a man's fading screams were played in reverse at the same time. As I began to nope out of there, I heard the metal clanging again, and I stopped. I thought, what if someone is stuck under a rock? What if someone needs help? It happens all the time out here. I ponied up and I ran down the hill. As I approached the cage out of the darkness, I see a massive shape throw itself at the side, desperately trying to get at me. I jumped back and screamed, thinking it wasn't a trapped climber, rather a bear mauling in progress. Without a single thought, I fired through what I now knew to be a steel trap of some kind. The thing yelped and slammed into the corner and sat still. Its breathing sounded almost like a car idle. It sat there breathing heavily in the cage that it could not escape. I soon began to fear that it was a person in that cage. For what reason I don't know, but I had still fired at it. My assumption of it being human quickly perished, as it stood back up on two legs and lunged at me, a hairy arm poking out through the bars of the cage and nearly clawing my face to shreds. Being so confused, so terrified, I turned around and I ran. Nothing made sense that night, and I was too scared to even struggle to think straight. As I put distance between us, I could hear the thing from the cage screaming again. The sound was horrible and made me nauseous. I ran till I got sick. I threw up, and I kept running. When I made it to a paved road, I called the police and the rangers, but when they arrived, all that amounted to was them suspecting me of something. I passed their little tests with flying colors. I was completely sober, but they didn't pay my story much mind. I can't stop thinking about it. What kind of camp did I stumble upon? What was that in the cage? Just what in the world is going on in the Blue Mountains? 2. The Wendigo by Frank L. I remember it clear as day. It was back in 1989. I was 12 years old, and I was with my dad, my Uncle Vincent, and my brother Joe. We had gone turkey hunting in Tennessee for a week. One day, we went out a couple of yards away from our camp because Vincent had caught sight of some turkeys. We went out and split up. Me and my dad went to the right, and Joe and Vincent went to the left. We were walking around silently, searching for our prey. It was quiet for a long time, and both me and my dad were beginning to think that Vincent hadn't seen anything. Maybe he had just dreamt of the turkeys. That's when we heard a sound. My dad shushed me and gave me the hand signal to follow. I did as he told me. We slowly walked up a hill. As we reached the top, my dad stopped and I nearly ran into him. I could see the side of his face. He was looking in the distance, and his skin was growing so pale. I don't think I'd ever seen his eyes so wide. I went up beside him, and I poked him, trying to figure out what was going on. He didn't budge, either ignoring me or just completely unaware that I was still there. Curious and worried, I followed his gaze, and I quickly saw what he was staring at. It was tall and pale. Its arms stretched to the length of its body, and it was staring in the distance, just standing still, as if enjoying the slight breeze. We watched in horror, too afraid to even breathe in case it might alert this odd creature. The tall, thin, and lumbering thing turned and walked back in the opposite direction, disappearing in the trees. And a few seconds later, a bone-chilling howl erupted from where it had disappeared. That's when my father and I ran back. We nearly collided with Joe and Vincent, and the looks on their faces told us that they had seen it too. In complete wordless silence, the four of us packed up and left for home. It wasn't until 19 years later that Vincent brought up the event again, asking us if we remembered what we saw that day. I hesitantly nodded my head, only for Vincent to say something else that horrified me. Yeah, it was bizarre enough that something like that exists, but to think there were two of them, unbelievable. Vincent and Joe had seen two of the things, and somehow that makes the event all the more terrifying. 3. I Barely Outran It by BDawg. It was a cold evening when my dad and I set out to go hunting. He told me beforehand that for better chances at seeing deer, we would head off in separate directions, but he reminded me that he'd be very close at all times, so I didn't have to worry. I nervously said, okay. My dad said he would stay on the hillside we were on, and he told me to keep hiking until my judgment told me that I had found a good spot. Soon I was alone and on my way, like my father had instructed me. I continued on, a sick feeling building up inside me. This was the first time I had gone on my own like this, but I reminded myself that if anything happened, I had my firearm, and my dad wasn't too far away. I ignored the feeling and didn't think about it until later, when I heard a noise behind me about 20 yards away. I immediately turned in that direction to check it out, thinking it was my dad who had decided to join me. But I saw nothing, save for some swaying branches that were motionless when I had passed them. When I turned forward once more to continue on my way, I nearly shouted, because my dad was in front of me. His lips were pursed, and he had his finger over them, telling me to be quiet. I was confused. How did he get in front of me so fast and so quietly? Why was he here at all? He grabbed me by the forearm and dragged me back in the direction that we had come from. Without a word, I simply followed him. Something had spooked him, and if it had spooked my dad, then I didn't want to be in the woods any longer. But not long after that, I began to hear branches breaking and heavy footsteps gaining on us. When I turned around, I saw the head of something. What I remember, something that is scarred into my mind, were massive antlers 7.5 feet off the ground. Whatever it was huge, and it was coming right for us. When we made it back to the truck, luckily in one piece, my dad peeled out of there. Halfway home, he finally said something after a long silence. He said, "I'm sorry." He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he promised he would never make me go alone again. 4. The Thing That Ate My Dog by Blade6109. It was maybe 6 years ago. I was 13 at the time. Me, my dad, and my brother were going coon hunting. We would go out nearly every night, taking the dogs with us to train them to compete in our local coon hunting clubs, and maybe even some bigger competitions. It was January. The three of us got our stuff together one night and went out to one of our usual hunting spots and began our hunt. At that point, I had been hunting for years, and so the dark never really scared me anymore, not like it did when I was a child. I actually came to enjoy it, seeing the different creatures that came out in the night and hearing all the bugs chirping. Oftentimes, you'd even hear a pack of coyotes out in the distance. It was all very peaceful to me. But it wasn't that night. That night was cold, quiet. The bright full moon should have been a sign of an easy hunt, but rather, it seemed like a terrifying omen. The three of us had just set the dogs loose and watched them scurry away, quickly trying to find the scent of a coon, and began to track. We followed the dogs. They began barking at a tree. Apparently, one of them had picked up the scent. Right away, though, I knew something was wrong. His barking wasn't the same as it usually was. It instead sounded like he was chasing something instead of tracking a scent. Not too long after, the other dog began to do the same. I looked over to my dad, and he had a puzzled look on his face. We waited a few minutes listening to the dogs and whatever they were chasing. When the barking suddenly stopped, my stomach sank. Now, we have Garmin tracking collars on both the dogs, and we had a handheld GPS that allowed us to find them. We looked at our mini-map to see where they had gone. We saw their blips on the map, and they had both gone completely still. Me, my brother, and my father, we looked at each other and quickly made our way to where the collars were, hoping that they were still attached. I was thinking maybe they ran down an armadillo hole, and that's why we couldn't hear them anymore. But soon after, we heard one of the dogs let out a very loud and painful yelp, like it was being attacked or it had gotten injured. Then it went quiet again. My brother, my father, and I stood there, checking the GPS tracker again, watching the screen and waiting for the dogs to move, but they still didn't. I was already feeling scared and had that feeling of, we need to get home fast. My dad said to us, we've got to go after them. They're probably in a hole again, they're gonna get themselves hurt. But my dad didn't believe that himself. There was a faltering in his voice. He was afraid. My dad is a big guy who has the don't mess with me look. He's 6'6", and he was a veteran of 20 years. He was hardly ever scared of anything. I let out a groan, and we all started following the tracker again towards the dog's location. It was quiet. Not even the bugs were chirping anymore, just the sound of our feet smashing through the forest. We get about 350 yards from the dog's location on the GPS, and all of a sudden, my dad says, "Stop." My brother and I listened and looked at him. His eyes were glued to the screen of the GPS. We ask him what's wrong, and he shows it to us. It showed one of the dogs flying through the forest, zigzagging quickly, but the other one was still motionless. We sat there for 5 minutes, and my dad starts walking toward the other dog, the stationary one. We arrive at a creek and follow it up to the dog's location and get right on it, but we don't see the dog. We look around for a minute, then suddenly my dad says loudly, "My God." I go over to where he's standing and shine my light into the creek, and I can see the red stains in the water. I followed the red trail up to the side of the creek, only to find half of what was left of the dog. I puked, busted a few blood vessels in my face. When I looked back at my dad, he was loading his weapon, and he was mad. My brother and I were standing there, shaking in our boots, just ready to go home. My dad tells me to go and get the tracker off the dog and get back up the bank. I wasted no time, and I went to get the tracker, but halfway up the bank, I froze. There was a loud boom. My dad had fired, seemingly right over my head. I looked over to where he shot, and standing there on the other side of the creek, about 200 feet from me, stood something at about 7 feet tall. It was hard to make out much detail, but I could see its massive yellow eyes and shimmering, moist fur. My dad yells at me to run, and the three of us bolt back to the truck. I didn't turn back, but I heard the most awful sound in my life. A loud, deep, chilling howl. A few seconds later, we heard it crashing through the water and chasing after us. It seemed like ages before we finally saw the truck. We climbed in quickly. We started it up and turned on our lights and light bar. Standing just to the left of the truck was this thing that looked like a wolf, lips curled back, revealing large teeth and a foaming mouth. It stood on all fours, but it was definitely no wolf, because it stood at half the size of our truck. My dad kicks it into drive, and as we pull away, he tries to run the thing over, but it jumps to the side. Then my dad floors it down the trail and hits the road soon, speeding twice the limit all the way home. We all sat quietly in the truck. My little brother starts crying, and I'm sitting there frozen with a "what the heck just happened" look on my face. I thought of the GPS tracker and asked my dad to let me see it. He hands it over, and I look at the screen. I can feel my skin turn pale. The tracker had stopped transmitting, but the last known location of the other dog that had been zigzagging all over the radar was right where we had parked. right where the thing had been standing. It was inside whatever that creature was. The following 2 stories are about ghost hunting, but hey, it's still hunting nonetheless. 5. A Demon Hates Me by John M. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was dating this girl named Anne. I was 21 and she was 24. We had been dating for a few months, but had known each other for years, and we decided to move in together and found a nice apartment. I worked part-time on nights, and sometimes while I was gone, Anne would pass the time by going ghost hunting with friends. One night before I went to work, I went shopping into a local store where I was friends with the manager when I received a call from Anne. She was begging me to come home right away because she had heard someone forcing their way in through the back door. Our back door was in the center of the apartment, locked from our side, and there was a set of stairs that led down to another outside door that was locked from the inside. So I didn't believe her until I heard the inner door slamming like someone was hitting it. I left the store and immediately ran home. When I got there, Anne and our friend Sarah were standing in the corner of our kitchen. I unlocked the door and slowly opened it, but there was no one there. I walked down the stairs and unlocked and opened the back door, yet I didn't see anyone still, not even any footprints in the snow. I turned to go back up the stairs, and when I did, I finally saw it. Bare human footprints on the steps all the way to the last step at the top of the stairs. I didn't know what to think about it at the time, honestly. Skip ahead a few weeks, and there were no incidents, and we forgot all about it. One night, after Anne had gone ghost hunting, we were sleeping in our bed. It was just us, because her daughter's father had her daughter for overnight visits this week. At around 1 in the morning, Anne woke up and started screaming. I jumped up, covered in goosebumps, and asked her what was wrong, and she told me she had had a nightmare and that she had seen a dark figure with red smoky eyes that told her it was following her and that it was mad at me. Before disappearing, it promised to prove itself real. We went back to sleep after an hour or so. That next night, at about midnight, our stereo turned on by itself. I thought Anne was pulling a prank to scare me, so I unplugged the stereo and I hid the remote. Only 15 minutes later, it came on again. I asked her to stop messing around and she said it wasn't her. I noticed she was still next to me in bed, so I got up and checked the stereo, and when I looked behind it, I was shocked. It was still unplugged. I tried to figure out how it turned on by itself, but I couldn't. I was dumbfounded. The next morning, Anne seemed a little off, which I thought was just from a lack of sleep. I was out trying to find a second job when I received a text stating that she could not be with me anymore, because something said that it would never stop until I was gone. Anne then confessed about all the things she had been doing while ghost hunting, some of which was pretty sketchy. She said she thinks something is now following her, but she still doesn't want to give up ghost hunting, and that was the end of that. I still don't know if it was a real demon or just Anne's psychotic way of dumping me, but the two of us haven't spoken since, and from what I've heard, Anne is still single and is not looking for a relationship. 6. College Haunting by Darkest Hour Videos. Everyone in town knows that our college campus is haunted. It's one of those things that you grow up telling spooky stories about at sleepovers, making all the other girls squeal when you suddenly pull out the jump scare. It wasn't anything a lot of people really ever worried about, unless you went to the school. I started college there back in the fall of 2010 as an art major. That meant I had to spend a lot of time in the humanities building. According to rumor, that was the most haunted building on campus. Over the years being there, I'd felt many weird things. It felt more eerie rather than dangerous, though, and I was very curious about it. Though I would get very bad feelings around the backstage area and going on the stairs that led down to the basement. But again, I would generally shrug it off as me just being a paranoid kid. After the first month or so, I got involved with a small group of people that enjoyed going ghost hunting on the weekends. They ended up getting special permission from one of the art professors to stay in the building late that night. I was invited to go on this little hunt as my first tester trip. They wanted to make sure that I would stay calm. We get there and go through a little safety spiel and break up into groups. Nothing much happens for the first little while, but then I suggest we head to the dark room on the second floor. Earlier that week, I had an experience in there and thought that maybe we could find something. Two of us out of the group go inside while the other two wait in the hallway. We begin a bit of radio silence to start the EVP session. During that time, I kept feeling something touching the back of my shirt and gently tugging down on it. I stay quiet and ignore it, hoping that maybe a voice was caught on the recording. We started to ask questions, and the tugs on the back of my shirt became harder and more obvious. I told the person with me, and he began to ask who it was that was tugging on my shirt. I began to feel extremely warm and uncomfortable in there, and I said I really wanted to get out of that room. I was quite claustrophobic, and two people in a small dark room was pushing it for me. However, the thought of an unseen entity wanting to mess with me while I was in such an uncomfortable position made it worse. We went out into the hallway and listened to the recordings. There was nothing there but white noise, our voices, and some whispering that we couldn't really make out. We chalked that up to the AC units in the building kicking on. It was still hot as heck, even though the summer was wrapping up. The rest of the time spent in two small groups was rather uneventful. We regrouped at 2 a.m., and we all went down to the basement together, and I wish I'd never gone. We all took our positions in the prop-filled basement. There was costume and prop storage down there, and we turned on a UV light. One of the guys said that he had read somewhere that entities may be attracted to it. A volunteer went and shut off the lights for the basement, and we began to wait. Once the lead said he was ready to turn out the lights, I got the distinct feeling that doing that would lead to a bad time. I had told him not to, basically begged him not to, but out went the light anyway. And immediately after, I felt something cold closing around my neck. I couldn't breathe. It felt like something was pulling all of the air out of my lungs, and I couldn't stand either. One of the guys caught me, and that ended the night's investigations. I had red marks on my neck that faded after a little while, but the guy that caught me had very tiny scratches near his eyes. We didn't do any more investigations for the rest of the summer, but the following semester, we all decided that we needed to have one more go at the building and see if what had happened was just a fluke. We broke up into groups again and had a rather uneventful night, until a little after midnight. While I was inside of a piano practice room with one of the others, the piece of the building was shattered, because we heard a scream, the sounds of running going down the stairs, the door to the stairway opening and closing, and the door to the outside opening and closing as well. And then the stairway door opened and closed again. The only problem with the second opening and closing of the stairway door was the fact that there were no footsteps to go along with it. We were all called to the auditorium for a little meeting. Turns out, the two that ran out of the building had been investigating near the second floor darkroom. While near the darkroom, they began to hear noises from inside the room and gentle knocks on the women's restroom door. On an EVP, they heard something say my name right before something inside the dark room fell. And that's what had them running out of the building. Because of this, I was asked to leave for the safety of the rest of the group. I was bummed out, of course, but I left. One of my friends in the group said they would come and see me afterwards. The rest of the story was told to me by this friend, and I have no personal recollection of this, and that really freaks me out. My friend came to my house after the investigation was over, and he found me sitting in the middle of my living room floor, with papers covered in weird ramblings and drawings spread all around me. He freaked, called a friend of ours that practiced Wicca. She came over to smudge and bless the house, hoping to get rid of whatever was there. He said I was pretty out of it the entire time, but I seemed normal the next day. I'm so grateful that he came to see me instead of going straight home. There's no telling what would have happened if I had remained like that. Now, all these years later, I still sometimes feel something dark in my house. I'm not sure if this entity followed me from the college or had been there before all of it, but I do know that I now sleep with holy water and my father's rosary beside my bed. 7. Skinwalker in My Dream by Eli A. I'm 15 years old, and I live 2 hours from Kenora, Ontario. It all began with a strange dream. In it, my father and I had brought home a deer, but as soon as we began to prep it, after we turned around for a moment and looked back, it had disappeared. All that was left was a red trail on the ground leading into the woods. And that was the dream. Simple and nothing out of the ordinary, right? Skip to a couple of months later. I went hunting with my dad on our property far from our town. It was about 6 in the morning, and it was freezing that day. I've never been so cold in my life. I was struggling to stay warm, and I didn't realize the forest was dead silent, which was weird because it's usually full of sounds like cows mooing nearby and birds, but there was nothing. Anyway, my dad and I were in 2 different tree stands about 10 feet apart, and we were watching a trail in between them on the ground. After 2 hours of inactivity, my dad managed to fall asleep waiting, while I sat there still. I started to hear the very faint sound of leaves crushing underfoot. As it slowly grew louder, I knew it was heading this way. I started to see a little bit of movement in the tall grass nearby, and when my eyes focused, I saw a huge male white-tailed deer eating some seeds on the ground. I reached slowly to grab my firearm while my dad was still sleeping. I looked through the scope toward the deer, and I saw that it was looking in my direction. I knew I had to make the shot before it fully realized we were there, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger that time. The most horrifying thing happened next. The deer stood up on 2 legs. Now that I had a full body look at it, I saw that it was not a deer, more like a man with a deer's legs and a head with antlers. It stared for about 30 seconds, and then it ran towards me. I freaked out, thinking it was going to come after me, but then it walked right under my tree stand and went the opposite way. I sat in the cold silence, wondering what on earth I just saw. The sounds began again, the wind, the cows, and birds. My dad woke up, and I told him we needed to go, that there's nothing here. We packed up and left. I still come out to the property every once in a while, but whenever I do, I always bring protection, hunting or not. 8. Red Eyes by Kyle. I've lived in Michigan my entire life. Wolves and wild dogs are pretty rare in my area. With that being said, one night my friend, his dad, and my dad were out on a late-night drive through our fields and forests. We were on our way back to the house. I was riding in the bed of the pickup truck when I looked in the grass and saw a pair of blood-soaked red eyes staring back at me. I jumped. The thing almost looked like a mix between a dog and a cat. I quickly told my dad, and he said it was probably just a panther. but those eyes proved otherwise. I've never seen anything like them. It looked more like a bloodhound or a Wendigo from the children's stories and legends. To make things worse, I've been going squirrel hunting ever since I got my hunter's safety permit and license, so I spend a lot of time in the woods during squirrel season. One day, while in a patch of snowy woods, a strong wind knocked me out of my chair and sent my gear blowing in front of me. I grabbed my pack and firearm and decided to call it a day. I began to walk back to the house, and while looking back at the woods, I saw those red eyes again, following me. I believe that big gust of wind had something to do with it, but maybe not. At night in that area, though, sometimes I hear loud screaming in the woods, and I wonder what it is. 9. Glad I Wasn't Alone by FullAutoAirSoft. It was 3 months ago, September as of writing this. Me and my friend Justin were gathering our gear to go for a deer hunt. It was a little past noon, so we didn't expect animals to start moving around yet. We had plenty of time to get prepared. Our usual hunting spot is only a 1.5 mile walk from the property. The spot we like to sit at gives us a view of the whole area. It's on top of a hill in a field. The woodline is directly behind us, so we're quite close to some deer bedding. I was armed with a compound bow, while Justin had a crossbow with a scope. Our plan was to sit till about 6, as it usually gets dark at around 5:45. One thing that was off about our hunt that day was that the whole place was a bit quiet, besides the occasional leaf falling or wind gusts. Since we saw nothing, we decided to move down the hill to get a different vantage point. I was putting my water bottle back in my day pack, preparing to move, but a sudden crunch made us both freeze in place. I slowly drew my bow, expecting a deer or coyote, but what we saw still haunts me to this day. I saw deer-like horns sticking out of the brush, so naturally I aimed in that direction, ready for a deer to come out any moment. But something was wrong. It was about 70 yards away, so I waited for it to come out into the open, but when it revealed itself, I was petrified, and I'm sure Justin was just the same. The whole place smelled of a rotten stench, something like sulfur. When it walked out, the creature had the head of a deer. One part of it in particular was burnt into my brain, and that was its eyes. Dark, empty black pits in the creature's head. It was about 4.5 feet tall on all fours, but that creature stood up like a man on its hind legs, scaling in at over 8 feet tall. It stood there, gazing out at the empty highway about a mile out. We did not want to get its attention, so we tried to be silent. I've never been so horrified in my life. Luckily, when a semi-engine braked, it scared the creature back into the woods. We waited 5 minutes, though, in silence, so if we ran, it wouldn't hear us, or at least it wouldn't catch up with us. All I can say is that if you're going out into the woods for any reason, it's always best to not go alone if you can. Take it from me, because no one wants an encounter like this to happen to them. 10. Skinwalker Hunting by James. I was 14 when I saw this. I've always been an outdoorsy type of kid. I used to grab one of my guns and go out into the woods 200 yards behind my house, and I would fire at anything that moved, or I would go on hunting. One day during October, I thought it was a good idea to go squirrel hunting, so I grabbed my 12 gauge and a box of shells. I made my way out and passed my mom, telling her I was going to a friend's place. I walked for a good 2 hours, not really seeing much of anything for the entire walk. I made it to the shelter I'd made when I was younger, and it's usually a hot spot for squirrels, but there was no activity whatsoever. I walked for another half hour before I got a weird feeling, like I was being watched. I thought some neighbor kid was trying to scare me, so I was at the ready and still, until an ear-splitting screech nearly made me drop my 12 gauge. It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in my life, but even so, I could tell it was a distance away from me. The last thing I wanted was for something that loud and terrifying to come any closer. I calmed myself down and gave a quick prayer. As it remained silent for a few more minutes, I was able to keep going and actually got a few squirrels before going back home. I was making my way back toward the shelter, but as I passed it, it was getting dark, and I was beginning to hear the sound of running all around me, like something was in the woods encircling me. Of course, that's when the ear-splitting shriek came again. This time it was so close, I thought my ears were going to bleed. Right after that, I began to hear something jumping through the branches on the trees. It sounded much heavier than your usual wildlife. I choked down a scream, and I watched something with a vaguely human shape jumping from branch to branch. I crawled into my hut, and I waited. When the sounds of the swaying branches carried off in the distance, that's when I ran. It was my opening to get away, and I took it. It took me 45 minutes to make it back to the house, but when I did, I broke through that door and slammed it shut. My mom ran into the living room, wondering what all the ruckus was about. Despite me crying and telling her my story, she was mad at me and grounded me, saying that staying out so late had given me nightmares and a fear of the dark. But that doesn't explain what I saw. What I saw was very real and far from natural. In every job, in every hobby and passion, there are people who have experienced some very horrifying things. Things they don't want to share out of embarrassment or even fear. But that's what Creepy Confessions is all about. A place to anonymously share the creepiest things that have happened to you. So come on over to darknessprevails.org and confess your scariest experiences to the world. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you want to support my channel further, you can donate any amount on my Patreon at patreon.com/darknessprevails, and you'll get your name in the credits at the end of these videos. Or download my free app Spooked on the Google Play Store. If you do have some extra cash, click that shop button below the video, or go to morbidmonsters.com and get yourself some creepy cool Darkness Prevails clothing. Now then, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 10 disturbing things found on farms. Lorena Guerrero says, just in time for my daily chores. Whatever helps you pass the time. Chores suck. If I could afford to pay someone to do my dishes forever, I would. Big C Christian says, manure and death. Now that's a lovely smell. Don't forget the lemon zest. Some Banana says, yes, I love you, Darkness. I'm gonna buy some of your merch. I live on a farm too. Sweetness, studies show that my merch looks best on farms. Deanosaur says, great, I listened to this while in the field, so the intro made me crazy paranoid. Thanks, awesome video as always. I'm glad you enjoyed. We're all over here playing checkers, but you're listening to this video playing 4D chess. Take note, people. If the video's about abandoned places, find your nearest broken down hospital and enjoy. And Xenomorphic says, it sucks that I always get an error when I try to click the bell notification symbol. Guess YouTube can't handle the sexiness of darkness. I don't know about sexy, but there is a whole lot of chub going on over here that no one can handle. Anyways guys, thanks so much for tuning in to another Darkness Prevails video. More scary stories are coming soon. Here are the credits to my faithful and amazing patrons who continue to donate. Until next time, this world is a strange one, so stay safe out there and stay creepy.